If there's any historic site that turns veteran archaeologists into weeping babies, it's Chaco Canyon. Even now that it's all ruins, Chaco Canyon is still as awe-inspiring and imposing as it once was, but it's equally just as absurd and bizarre, at least at first glance. For perspective, Chaco Canyon was the economic, commercial, and cultural epicenter of America during the pre-Columbian era. You can see influences of Chacoan culture in the ruins of neighboring cities, especially in their architecture. Chaco boasted multiple great houses, colossal palace-like structures featuring hundreds of rooms. The largest great house, Pueblo Bonito, featured nearly 1,000 rooms. But this is where it all stops making sense. For how large Chaco Canyon is, especially with all the great houses, one would expect that the place was a bustling town. But archaeological findings suggest the opposite. Current estimates put Chaco Canyon's total population at 2,000 people, which begs the question, where did Chaco get the labor to build this massive city? And who was this city then built for if there weren't many people to inhabit it anyway? The valley itself on which Chaco Canyon sits is another oddity. To put it simply, Chaco Canyon is a barren, uninhabitable desert, with a harsh climate, no river, and hardly any trees. In fact, the 250,000 trees used to build the great houses of Chaco Canyon had to be imported on foot from other locations. Which brings up another question. Why Chaco Canyon? Why build such a magnificent city in such a barren location with no natural resources? And here's where it gets completely absurd. The Chacoans spent about 300 years building their capital city, but then, one day, out of the blue, they packed up and left Chaco Canyon, never to build anything of the sort ever again. Why? Chaco Canyon was the heart of one of the most sophisticated and advanced cultures of ancient North America, and it's not difficult to see why. Even from the ruins, you can tell that Chaco Canyon was an impressive feat of architecture and engineering. But much more than that, archaeological evidence suggests that the Chacoans had an incredibly complex culture, much of which has escaped modern comprehension. As we go along, we will be looking into the various aspects of this culture, from its complex social organization to its perplexing governance to the more macabre religious rites. For now, however, let's talk about the one aspect of Chaco Canyon that everyone is immediately struck by: the architecture. 15 great houses dot Chaco Canyon. But of these great houses, Pueblo Bonito steals the show as the belle of the ball. I mean, even from a modern point of view, this palatial edifice is still quite something. The building sits on a sprawling 3 acres of land, featuring walls that are up to 3 feet thick. Archaeologists estimate that this building probably accommodated up to 4 or 5 stories, with over 800 rooms that could house up to 1,000 residents. And this was really unique for its time, because hardly anyone ever set out to build multi-story structures out the gate. The more common thing was to add more stories as time went on, but all Chacoan great houses were built to be high-rise buildings from the start. Yet another unique thing about Chacoan great houses was the masonry technique used, especially at that time, because the techniques had never before been seen. In fact, neighboring cities would later copy these techniques as evidenced in their own architecture, showing the influence of Chacoan culture in the region and in that era. Many Chacoan great houses took decades or even centuries to build. Pueblo Bonito, for instance, took about 300 years to complete, which immediately raises some mind-boggling questions. The Chacoans did not leave behind any written records. In fact, there's no evidence that they even had a written language. How then were the original designers of these buildings able to pass down the plans through multiple generations and still end up with buildings this sophisticated and accurate? Take Pueblo Bonito, for instance. The building takes up the shape of a semicircle, and has at its center a precise north-south line that splits the courtyard into two halves. In fact, Pueblo Bonito and other great houses like Una Vida, Tetrocatel, and Peñasco Blanco also featured sophisticated astronomical markers, water control devices, and communication features. Even the mere fact that some of these buildings rose as high as 4 to 5 stories and didn't suffer any structural failure until they were abandoned is a feat of engineering, especially without any written plan whatsoever. How did this ancient tribe achieve that? And as we pointed out before, where did the labor force for this gargantuan project come from? Building Pueblo Bonito, 14 other great houses, not to mention the hundreds of small houses called unit pueblos on the other side, isn't a small feat, even if you have 300 years to do it. A total population of 2,000, of which the labor force is still going to be a fraction, is just not enough to achieve the sheer size and complexity involved in the architecture at Chaco Canyon. They would have needed thousands of workers and then a highly efficient and complex leadership to organize the numerous work parties around core operations like logistics, construction, trade, food, water, and shelter. Think about it. No mail, no phone, not even a written language, and yet such a large labor force was somehow organized to build one of the wonders of the world across generations. It ought to be an impossible feat. Which takes us to the question of resources. About 250,000 trees were used to build Chaco Canyon, and only a tiny fraction came from the local area. Chaco Canyon was so barren that there were hardly any trees, and even the trees present weren't strong enough for building houses. So the Chacoans had to travel up to 50 miles on foot to nearby regions like Chusca, Zuni, and Mount Taylor to import trees. The insane part? They imported all these trees on foot. No wheels, no pack animals, nothing. But it gets even stranger, because there aren't a lot of fire pits, sleeping areas, or other sections typically used for household chores as you'd find in a normal residential dwelling. Instead, Chaco has a lot of what is called a kiva. A kiva is a kind of pit used for religious ceremonies. And when I say there are lots of kivas at Chaco Canyon, I mean there are lots of kivas. Pueblo Bonito, for instance, has 40 kivas, which comes down to 1 kiva for every 29 rooms, or 1 kiva for every 2 residents. Again, this begs the question, why? And the strangeness is not even close to being done, because we have roads. How do we explain the presence of roads in Chaco Canyon? We're talking about over 800 miles of well-engineered roads, some of them connecting the great houses, others ending abruptly and leading absolutely nowhere. What's even more curious about these roads is the fact that this region of North America didn't have the wheel yet. There's no evidence that Chacoans used carts or any other form of transportation that could have involved a wheel. So why were roads constructed? Just for walking? That seems odd, but probably not as odd as the engineering details of the roads themselves. So the main roads are about 33 feet wide, while the secondary roads are about half that. And this is weird because, as I said before, Chaco didn't have vehicles, so even if these roads were built for walking, why were they this wide? On top of that, the roads are extremely straight, and they never once avoid any obstacle. In other words, if the road met a cliff, the builders built a stairway. And if it met a mountain, the builders just went over it and continued the road. Now, the engineers might not have avoided obstacles, but they did avoid one thing: gentle curves. All Chaco roads are extremely straight, with sharp turns, even when the roads have to branch off to another location. The reason all of this is amazing, even for archaeologists, is because even right now, as you are watching this video and subscribing, Some projects are almost impossible to complete in today's world despite our advancement in construction and technology. I mean, even large projects taken on by billionaires still end up being abandoned. So, when you put all these in perspective, it's really a mind boggling question how a civilization with significantly less than what we have today was able to achieve a 300-year-old construction project that honored the original blueprint. As if that isn't enough, Chaco Canyon also shows literally no signs of any defense systems, even though the place boasted incredible wealth. And Chacoans did amass wealth at an unprecedented scale. For instance, Pueblo Bonito had one room specially dedicated to red macaw parrots. And if you know your birds, you know that's a notoriously expensive bird, both to acquire and to raise. Even back then, the case was the same, or perhaps even more so, as red macaw parrots were considered status symbols and markers of political status. From hundreds of thousands to turquoise beads, to shell beads, to jet beads, to copper bells. They even found evidence of chocolates. These guys were wealthy. But they must have been something much more powerful than wealthy, because they had no security system set up to at all protect all of their valuables. Even more head-scratching was that the residents of Chaco Canyon didn't bother taking all of their artifacts with them when they abruptly left Chaco Canyon. Were they so wealthy that they were able to leave that much behind after gathering their most precious items? Or did something more sinister happen? Before we go into the theories surrounding the Chacoans and their sudden disappearance, let's talk about one more thing: how the Chacoans were able to display remarkable astronomical knowledge centuries before the telescope was invented. Archaeologists have pointed out that when you observe the walls of the great houses in Chaco Canyon, you find that they were built according to astronomical observations. Chitrocatel and Pueblo Bonito, for instance, are oriented to face the direction of the rising and setting moon. In fact, when the moon reaches its lunar standstill, which happens every 18.6 years, the phenomenon is perfectly framed by the house's doorways. Not only that, 12 of the great houses align with the solar, equinox, and solstice cycles as well. The sheer scale and accuracy are insane. So, astronomers believe that there must have been intergenerational astronomical knowledge involved. But how did a culture without a written language develop and pass down such complex ideas that still elude most modern people today? And even more perplexingly, what made them abandon their capital-like city with its elegant buildings and impressive network of excellently built roads so abruptly? And why did they never build something like that ever again? Multiple theories abound. So, when we talk about the Chacoans who built and lived in Chaco Canyon, more specifically, we're talking about the Anasazi, or the ancestral Pueblones, as their descendants now prefer to refer to their ancestors. The stories about the ancestral Pueblo and their time in Chaco Canyon go from quite fascinating to blood-curdlingly macabre. I'm talking of tales as gruesome as cannibalism with evidence gathered from the site itself. Yet to this day, the jury is still out as to which of the popular theories is true. But let's take it from the top. As you can possibly tell just by looking at the Hopi people who descended from them, the ancestral Pueblo were a deeply religious people. Their mythology speaks of gods who ascended through an underground portal known as Sipapu and taught them skills in a wide range of crafts, including masonry, pottery, archery, and agriculture. In fact, for all of their history, the ancestral Pueblo lived in large underground dwellings and only made baskets. But then, by 750 CE thereabout, they started building cities above ground with stone and remarkable masonry techniques. According to certain sources, it was the gods who passed down the wisdom to the ancestral Pueblo. And perhaps this reminds you of another legend, right? Exactly, the Anunnaki and the Sumerians. In case you didn't already know, the Sumerian civilization was like your ancient version of today's Silicon Valley. The basic principles of agriculture, architecture, and even writing were all handed down to us by the Sumerians, who, interestingly, also had access to little or no natural resources until the gods came to give them knowledge on how to make something out of nothing. Again, this sounds similar to what we know about the Chacoans. And so, some people go as far to posit that the gods of the Chacoans were actually the Anunnaki. According to this school of thought, the Anunnaki fled to the Americas after the fall of Sumer. Of course, make of that what you will, but we won't be able to descend into that rabbit hole today. In the meantime, however, it's probably worth pointing out that the Mesoamericans, South Americans, and the ancestral Pueblones all share similar mythologies involving certain themes we can also see in the Sumerian mythology of the Anunnaki. A very obvious one would be the Ant People, whom the Hopi claim saved them from global catastrophe twice and impacted them with skills and advanced technology. In Hopi, Anu is the word for ant, and Naki is the word for friend. So when you put it together, Anunnaki to the Hopi would mean ant friend, which has led some to theorize that perhaps the ant people that the Hopi say helped their ancestors, the ancestral Pueblones, were actually the Anunnaki. Once again, make of that what you will. For now, though, let's get back to our main point. So far, we've been able to build the theory that the ancestral Pueblones probably learned the skills they used to build the majestic Chaco Canyon from their gods. You decide whether it's the Ant People or the Anunnaki, but it still doesn't explain why the Chacoans chose such an arid region. First, notice the abundance of kivas at Chaco. Secondly, the absurdity of the choice of location altogether. Thirdly, the astronomical principles guarding the building choices made by the Chacoans. And then there's also the sheer amount of work poured into building Chaco Canyon. When you add them all up, the only reasonable explanation that can possibly tie all of this together is that the people did it for a religious purpose. Think about it. There's no logical reason why the builders would choose to erect such magnificent structures in the middle of a barren, barely habitable desert. But what if it wasn't about habitation? What if they thought the land was sacred? Around that time, lands were considered sacred if it was believed that the gods landed there. So perhaps this was the case with Chaco Canyon, right? I mean, they believed the gods landed on that valley when they arrived on Earth, so they built this massive capital-like city to honor that. Very possible, right? But how do we explain the buildings and structures? Once again, this might be resolvable coming from the religious angle. The ancestral Pueblones, just like their Mesoamerican and South American cousins, had in their religious myths legends of white bearded people who came to them, taught them, and then promised to return. For the ancestral Pueblo, this legend is captured in the myth of the Pahana, or the lost white brother, whom the Hopi people are still expecting to return and usher in a new age of peace. Alright, so pause for a second. I know I shouldn't say this, but I know some people would leave some bait-like rude comments below making the lost white brother a race thing. It's not. It's really not. The concept of Pahana, or the lost white brother, was part of the ancestral Pueblo culture and what they believed in. It was certainly not a race thing, so don't make it one. Now, according to the myths, the lost white brother will come in from the east, which is why the Hopi people bury their dead facing their direction. So, could it also explain why their ancestors were also obsessed with astronomical phenomena? Very possibly. And if the ancestral Pueblones were looking forward to the return of the gods, then it would make sense why they were willing to go through such extreme measures to build such a majestic temple palace. They obviously had more pressing chores, like growing the food they were to eat, but they invested all that time building a massive capital city where only a handful of people lived. A sacred spiritual obligation makes the most logical sense as the impetus for this kind of work. Alright, now let's talk about the ancestral pueblo's sudden disappearance. And for this, there are two popular theories. Now, this is where things start to get really dark, so buckle down. To begin with, the sudden collapse of Chaco Canyon, though mysterious, isn't the first of its kind. About 300 years before Chaco fell, a similar fate befell the Maya civilization. Maya suddenly collapsed in a way that has defied explanation for centuries. But here's the much darker parallel. Depending on how much you know of ancient cultures, you probably already know that the Maya civilization seemed to have practiced cannibalism, perhaps as part of religious rituals. Well, as it turns out, so did the Chacoans. Or at least that's what the evidence suggests, even though there's some disagreement on that among scholars. Anyway, according to certain sources, the Anasazi were a very powerful, but also a very wicked people. It is said that the Anasazi worshipped the darkness and were known for their massively prosperous slave trade, where they subjected their conquered rivals to the most cruel forms of torture ever known to man in order to enforce obedience. The Anasazi were also said to routinely carry out human sacrifices in their kivas. And yes, the rites did involve cannibalism. Obviously, the Anasazi were a very ruthless and powerful people with the ability to organize their society at the most complex levels, so they were able to galvanize their slaves to build all the massive structures in Chaco Canyon. The diversity of construction techniques reflected in the buildings at Chaco Canyon is proof of this fact, according to proponents of this theory. The beginning of the end for the Anasazi started when they started to go against the holy men, powerful shamans who were highly revered among the Chacoans at that time. Those who hold on to this theory claim that the Anasazi were extremely arrogant and mocked the holy men. So one day, the holy men punished the Anasazi by destroying their land. The punishment came in the form of a strong wind, which blew and caused Chaco Canyon to collapse on itself. When that happened, the slaves of the Anasazi saw this as their opportunity to rebel against their masters, so they destroyed what was left of Chaco and fled never to return. Question is, does this theory line up with the reality at Chaco Canyon? Well, you could say yes. There are definitely certain interesting clues discovered by archaeologists that may help ground this theory. For instance, archaeologists note that the timbers used to roof the kivas were each deliberately and individually removed, suggesting human action. Entrances to the kivas were also boarded up, and the kivas themselves showed signs of fire damage, suggesting that there was probably a revolt, which led to the collapse. Now, when you think about it logically, it does make sense. People were enslaved and forced to engage in this Herculean undertaking to build projects that had nothing to do with them. Meanwhile, they were hardly given any food or water, and they had to watch as their loved ones were ritually murdered and eaten. Of course, when the opportunity presented itself, they immediately took advantage to retaliate against their overlords and then flee without looking back. I mean, it was only a matter of time, right? Well, that's just one theory. There's another equally bloody theory. Only this time, the ancestral Puebloans are portrayed as the victims. According to holders of this theory, before the Anasazi made their home in Chaco Canyon, they were victims of constant marauding from a band of thugs known as the Toltecs. The Toltecs were ritual cannibals who suppressed the Anasazi for decades, until the Anasazi managed to escape to Chaco Canyon somehow. This claim might be supported by hard facts, as some archaeologists believe that the fact that Chaco Canyon is built far away from water and up in the mountains might suggest that the Chacoans were trying to hide from their enemies. Thus, they posit that the great houses were built not for habitation, but for defense. This would explain why barely 60 people resided at Pueblo Bonito. If Chaco Canyon was built as a defense, then perhaps the hundreds of rooms in the great houses were built not for habitation, but to add to the size of the building and intimidate invaders into keeping off. As to how their ancestors, the ancestral Pueblones, disappeared, the Hopi believed they were simply whisked away. In other words, the spirit called and they just left. I mean, there's the obvious question of how the Anasazi were then able to produce descendants after them, but this isn't a significant objection against the supernatural theory, as it could be that they weren't all whisked away, and the ones that were left moved away and started afresh. Now, for believers, these theories may sound pretty sufficient to explain the mystery of Chaco Canyon, and honestly speaking, there aren't that many solid objections against this social collapse theory. Sure, different sources might add or remove certain details while recounting, but generally the accounts are quite similar. There was a social collapse involving religious rites and cannibalism, and Chaco was never the same again. Interestingly, even skeptics are unable to provide a reasonable theory to explain the existence of Chaco Canyon. They do, however, think that they might be able to explain why the Chacoans suddenly disappeared. The problem? Each of these theories has holes. So, for many scientists, the simple explanation for the fall of Chaco Canyon is deforestation. The Chacoans felled way too many trees and practiced unsustainable agricultural methods, which in turn led to erosion and the destruction of agricultural fields, eventually ending up in a scarcity of food. So, with food no longer available, the people had no choice but to move. Probably makes you think about it because it seems like history is about to repeat itself in our time as environmentalists keep trying to warn us. But not so fast. Some researchers say we shouldn't jump to conclusions yet. W. H. Willis, Brandon L. Drake, and Witherby B. Dorshow are from the Department of Anthropology at the University of New Mexico, and according to them, there's no substantial evidence to support that Chaco Canyon fell because of deforestation. In a report published in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, the researchers wrote, "There is no direct evidence for human impact on local woodlands during the Bonito phase, the period of high construction from AD 850 to 1150. No indication that agriculture fields were destroyed by deforestation or any other process, and surprisingly, no conclusive information about the amount and sources of archaeological wood. Indeed, Chaco residents had available sources of timber and other natural resources that certainly were less costly than those indicated in collapse models." Which takes us to the next theory: drought. Some skeptics say it was drought that caused the Chaco civilization to fall. Others say it was both drought and deforestation. Whatever the case, the drought theory may have some grounding in reality because there is a record of a 50-year drought that happens to coincide with the period in which the Chacoans abandoned their city. This is perhaps the most popular theory about Chaco's collapse, but as I said, even this theory has holes. The first is that Chaco Canyon was an arid land with barely any rainfall to begin with. This was why the Chacoans developed irrigation systems. Now, given their very small population, it doesn't seem likely that a drought would have affected their lifestyle in any major way that they'd have packed up and moved. They had been surviving in that location with barely any rainfall for over 3 decades at that point. Secondly, the ancestral Pueblones have been known to survive much worse. In fact, their corn varieties are some of the most drought-resistant varieties you could possibly come in contact with. Some of them are even still available today if you want to check them out yourself. But the point is, it would have taken a lot more than a mere drought to drive the ancestral Pueblo out of their home. They had already fully adapted to the location, so the drought theory doesn't work. In fact, after conducting an elaborate investigation, the National Academy of Sciences had this to say. After extensive review, the archaeological and environmental record failed to produce evidence of an event that was severe enough to cause the people to abandon their settlements. So, if we're to trust the words of the experts, then it appears we're back to the social collapse theory. Some way, somehow, these deeply spiritual people suffered a collapse in their societal order and then left, never to come back again. The question is, how exactly did it happen? Was it the aftermath of a revolt against the cannibalist ancestral Puebloan overlords? Or were the ancestral Pueblo simply whisked away by the gods? The truth is quite difficult to make out, because Native Americans are hesitant to divulge specific details of their sacred histories to non-tribe members. Of course, this is totally their prerogative. But it does leave the door to speculation wide open, which is really all anyone can do at this point. So, what's your best guess? Let me know by dropping your comments down below. And if you're still in the mood for creepy locations with unsolved mysteries, then make sure to check out our video on the Alaska Triangle, a place that makes the Bermuda Triangle look like a walk in the park. Over 20,000 unexplained disappearances and counting. Why? Find out when you click this video.